The experiments so horrific, America gave them immunity. In the frozen plains of Manchuria, behind walls guarded by soldiers and shrouded in absolute secrecy, Japanese doctors in white coats were conducting experiments that would make even the Nazi physicians at Auschwitz recoil in horror. They called their victims marutas, meaning logs, as if they were nothing more than pieces of wood to be used and discarded. These weren't soldiers captured in battle or prisoners of war, afforded even the basic protections of international law. These were men, women, and children. Civilians rounded up from villages, accused of nothing, guilty of nothing except being in the wrong place when the Japanese Imperial Army needed fresh test subjects for their biological warfare program. Unit 731 operated from 1936 until the end of World War II in 1945, and what happened within its walls represents one of the darkest chapters in human history. The facility, located in Pingfang near Harbin in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, was enormous, sprawling across 6 square kilometers with more than 150 buildings. It had its own airport, its own rail system, and housing for thousands of persons. From the outside, it looked like a water purification plant or a lumber mill, deliberately designed to deflect attention. The Japanese called it the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, a name so bland and bureaucratic that no one would think to look closer. But inside, scientists under the command of Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii were pushing the boundaries of human cruelty in the name of military advancement. The prisoners arrived by train, crammed into cattle cars, confused and terrified. Chinese civilians made up the majority, but there were also Russians, Mongolians, Koreans, and some Allied prisoners of war, including Americans. They were taken to cells in a massive concrete building that locals called the Zhongma prison camp. The cells were small, barely large enough for a person to lie down, and kept deliberately cold. They were logs now, inventory to be managed and used. What happened next defies comprehension. The doctors at Unit 731 were testing biological weapons, trying to determine the most effective ways to deploy diseases like plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhoid against enemy population. To do this, they needed to know exactly how these diseases affected the human body, how long symptoms took to develop, how the infections spread, and most importantly, how quickly they killed. So they infected prisoners deliberately, injecting them with pathogens or feeding them food laced with bacteria. Then they waited, observing as the diseases ravaged their victims' bodies. The doctors took detailed notes, measuring temperatures, documenting symptoms, tracking the progression of illness with the cold precision of scientists studying laboratory animals. But the experiments didn't stop at infection. The doctors wanted to see the diseases at work inside the body, to observe the physical damage to organs and tissues. So they performed vivisections, dissecting prisoners while they were still alive, without anesthesia. The screams echoed through the halls of Unit 731 as doctors cut open conscious men and women, removing organs, examining infected tissue, measuring the spread of bacteria through living systems. Using anesthesia would have contaminated the results, the doctors reasoned, would have altered the body's natural responses to infection. The prisoners had to be alive and aware for the experiments to have scientific value. After the vivisections were complete, the bodies were burned in massive crematoria that ran day and night, sending plumes of smoke into the Manchurian sky. Frostbite experiments were conducted with similar brutality. Prisoners were taken outside in the depths of winter when temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero. Their arms were bared and exposed to the freezing air, sometimes with water poured over them to accelerate the freezing process, freeing them. Guards and doctors would strike the frozen limbs with sticks, listening for the sound that indicated the flesh had frozen solid. Then the prisoners were taken inside, and doctors tested different methods of thawing the frozen tissue. Some limbs were plunged into hot water, others into cold water, others thawed gradually at room temperature. The doctors wanted to know which method caused the most damage and which, if any, could restore functionality to frostbitten limbs. When the experiments were complete, the prisoners were often returned outside for the process to begin again, this time with different parts of their bodies frozen and thawed until there was nothing left to test. The pressure chamber experiments were equally merciless. Prisoners were sealed inside chambers where doctors could control the air pressure, simulating the effects of high altitude. The pressure was reduced slowly, and doctors observed through thick glass windows as prisoners' eyes bulged from their sockets, as their organs began to rupture, as blood vessels burst and hemorrhages bloomed across their skin. Some prisoners were subjected to rapid decompression, the pressure dropping suddenly to mimic an explosive depressurization in an aircraft. Their lungs would rupture, their intestines would be forced out of their bodies, and still the doctors watched and took notes, quantifying the effects, determining the limits of human survival. Other experiments tested the effects of weapons. Prisoners were tied to stakes at various distances from explosions and bombarded with shrapnel to determine the most effective killing radius of grenades and bombs. They were exposed to flamethrowers to measure burn patterns and survival times. They were locked in gas chambers and exposed to different chemical weapons while doctors monitored how quickly they died and how much suffering each agent caused. Some prisoners were used to test new surgical techniques, with doctors performing unnecessary amputations, organ removals, and experimental surgeries without any medical justification beyond practice and curiosity. The sexual violence perpetrated at Unit 731 remains one of its most horrifying aspects. Female prisoners were repeatedly raped by guards and officers, often becoming pregnant as a result. But pregnancy wasn't seen as a complication. It was seen as an opportunity. Pregnant women were infected with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases, then vivisected so doctors could observe the effects of disease on both mother and fetus. Some women were forced to carry pregnancies to term, only to have their babies taken away and used in separate experiments. The complete dehumanization of the victims, the reduction of human beings to experimental material, represents a moral abyss that challenges our understanding of how such evil can exist within ordinary people. And the people conducting these experiments were ordinary. That's perhaps the most disturbing part. Shiro Ishii was a brilliant microbiologist, educated at Kyoto Imperial University, a man who could have used his talents to save lives. Instead, he convinced the Japanese military establishment that biological weapons represented the future of warfare, that they could compensate for Japan's smaller industrial base compared to Western powers. The doctors and technicians who worked under him weren't sadistic monsters, plucked from asylums. They were trained physicians, scientists, researchers who had taken oaths to heal and protect life. Many were recruited straight from universities, young doctors eager to serve their country and advance their careers. They published papers based on their research, attended conferences, and discussed their findings with colleagues. They just never mentioned that their data came from human experimentation on an unprecedented scale. The scale of units, the Americans could spend decades trying to catch up, or they could simply make a deal with the devil. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of the American occupation forces in Japan, authorized negotiations with Shiro Ishii and other Unit 731 leaders. The deal was simple and morally bankrupt. In exchange for complete immunity from prosecution for war crimes, Ishii and his team would turn over all of their research data to the United States. The Americans would get the results of experiments that no ethical researcher could ever conduct, giving them a significant advantage in biological warfare research. Ishii and his colleagues would go free, avoiding the hangman's noose that awaited Nazi doctors tried at Nuremberg for similar crimes. The deal was made in secret, hidden from the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal that was simultaneously prosecuting Japanese military leaders for atrocities committed during the war. When Soviet prosecutors demanded that Japanese biological warfare researchers be tried for war crimes, the Americans claimed there was insufficient evidence. They lied, protecting the men of Unit 731 because their knowledge was deemed more valuable than justice for their victims. The data was transferred to Fort Detrick in Maryland, where the American biological warfare program was based. American scientists pored over the Japanese research, incorporating the findings into their own weapons development programs. Shiro Ishii lived out the rest of his life in freedom, dying of throat cancer in 1959 at the age of 67. He never faced trial, never expressed remorse, never acknowledged the suffering he had caused. Other members of Unit 731 went on to distinguished careers in post-war Japan. Some became professors at prestigious universities, training the next generation of doctors and scientists. Others went into private practice, treating patients and contributing to their communities. Many became wealthy and respected members of society. One former Unit 731 doctor, Masaji Katano, became the head of the Green Cross Corporation, one of Japan's largest pharmaceutical companies. Another, Ryuichi Nato, founded the Japan Blood Bank, which later became a major medical supply company. The victims of Unit 731 received no such consideration. Chinese survivors and families of victims sought recognition and compensation for decades, but were met with silence and denial from the Japanese government. For many years, Japan refused to acknowledge that Unit 731 had engaged in human experimentation at all, maintaining that it had been a legitimate medical research facility. It wasn't until 1997 that a Japanese court officially acknowledged the existence of Unit 731 and its activities, though the court still rejected compensation claims. Even today, the full truth about Unit 731 is not widely taught in Japanese schools, and many Japanese citizens remain unaware of the atrocities committed in their country's name. The American decision to grant immunity to the members of Unit 731 represents one of the most controversial aspects of the post-war period. It raises fundamental questions about justice, morality, and the price of scientific knowledge. Was the data obtained through such horrific means truly valuable enough to justify letting mass murderers go free? Was it ethical to use knowledge gained through torture and human experimentation, even if it could potentially save lives in the future? The Americans argued that they were operating in a different moral universe, that the Cold War required hard choices, that denying themselves access to the data while the Soviets might obtain it would have been irresponsible. But these arguments ring hollow when confronted with the reality of what happened at Unit 731 and the message sent to the world when the perpetrators faced no consequences. The legacy of Unit 731 extends beyond the immediate victims. The experiments conducted there violated every principle of medical ethics, betraying the fundamental purpose of medicine as a healing profession. The doctors who participated demonstrated that education and scientific training are no guarantee against evil, that perfectly ordinary people can commit extraordinary atrocities when they dehumanize their victims and convince themselves that their work serves a greater good. The fact that these doctors faced no consequences, that many prospered in their post-war careers, sends a chilling message about accountability and justice. The story of Unit 731 forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the fragility of moral restraints. It shows how easily people can rationalize cruelty when they convince themselves they're serving their nation, advancing science, or following orders. It reveals how bureaucracy and dehumanizing language can create psychological distance between perpetrators and victims, allowing doctors to saw into living human beings while maintaining their self-image as professionals doing valuable work. The use of the term barutas instead of people, the reference to experiments instead of torture, the framing of mass murder as research, these linguistic tricks allowed the doctors of Unit 731 to avoid confronting the horror of what they were doing. Today, the site of Unit 731 in Pingfang houses a museum dedicated to documenting the atrocities committed there. Visitors can walk through reconstructed cells, view photographs of victims, and read survivor testimonies. The museum serves as a memorial to the dead and a warning to the living about the dangers of unchecked power, dehumanization, and moral compromise. But the museum is controversial in Japan, where nationalist groups argue that it represents Chinese propaganda and an unfair attack on Japanese national pride. The debate over how to remember Unit 731 continues to divide Japanese society, reflecting deeper tensions about how nations confront difficult histories. The medical data obtained from Unit 731 has never been fully declassified by the United States. though some documents have been released over the years. Researchers and historians continue to debate whether the data had any real scientific value or whether it was simply the product of sadistic curiosity dressed up as research. Many of the experiments were poorly designed, lacking proper controls or scientific rigor, and the data may have told American researchers more about what happens when you torture people to death than about infectious diseases or weapons development. If that's true, then the decision to grant immunity to Ishii and his colleagues was not just immoral, but also pointless, a bargain with the devil that gained nothing of value. The story of Unit 731 reminds us that the past is never truly past, that historical atrocities cast long shadows into the present. The decisions made in 1945 to protect Japanese war criminals in exchange for scientific data continue to affect international relations today, contributing to tensions between China and Japan and complicating efforts at historical reconciliation. The victims of Unit 731 and their descendants still seek acknowledgement and justice, still demand that the truth be told and remembered. Their suffering was real, their deaths were unjust, and they deserve better than to be forgotten in the name of political convenience or national pride. Fine. We tell these stories not to wallow in darkness or to condemn entire nations for the crimes of the past, but to understand how such evil became possible and to prevent it from happening again. The doctors of Unit 731 were not born monsters. They were educated professionals who made choices, terrible choices, to participate in atrocities. They convinced themselves that their work was important, that the suffering they inflicted served a greater purpose, that their victims weren't really people in the way that they were people. These are the same rationalizations used by perpetrators of atrocities throughout history, from the Nazi doctors at Auschwitz to the physicians who conducted the Tuskegee syphilis experiment on unwitting African American men in the United States. The experiment so horrific that America gave them immunity. That single sentence captures the moral failure at the heart of the Unit 731 story. Justice was sacrificed for perceived strategic advantage. Victims were abandoned in favor of their tormentors. The fundamental principle that some lines should never be crossed, no matter the potential benefit, was violated by the very nations that claimed to be fighting for civilization and human dignity. The Americans who made the deal with Ishii convinced themselves they were being pragmatic, but pragmatism that requires you to protect mass murderers is not pragmatism at all. It is moral cowardice disguised as strategic thinking. In the end, the story of Unit 731 stands as a warning about the dangers of treating human beings as means rather than ends, of valuing knowledge over dignity, of choosing expedience over justice. The men and women who died in those concrete cells in Manchuria, who were frozen and burned and infected and dissected, they were not logs. They were people with names and families and dreams and futures stolen from them. They deserved justice, and instead they got silence. They deserved remembrance, and instead they got decades of denial. Their story demands to be told, not because it is easy or comfortable, but because forgetting these atrocities makes it easier for them to happen again. The experiments so horrific that America gave them immunity must never be forgotten, and the victims of Unit 731 must never be reduced to footnotes in the history books. They were people, and they mattered, and we owe them the truth.